It's so good to be here, everyone. How's everyone doing? Good. Like Jeff said, I am Dom Ruso, and I've heard so many good things about Connexus over the years. And like Jeff said, we were on a train and we were chatting, and it's been a busy weekend. How many of you had a busy weekend already? Busy, long weekend? Yeah, I officiated a wedding. I got on a train. I got on a plane, and all this stuff. And so it's so good to finally be here and to share with you something that I think impacts all of us. And it has to do with how we deal with expectations when they start to fall apart. But before I say that, I want to tell you that over the past, since yesterday with Jeff, by the way, he didn't have to twist my arm. I'm just so happy to be here. The second time I come, you'll have to twist my arm. No, kidding. If you're watching online, I'm really honored to be here. But being with Jeff and hearing about the things that God's doing here, I just want to say to you something that maybe you don't hear or doesn't come through as clearly is that Jeff and the team here love you so much. They really, really love you. Okay, just let that sink in. Because sometimes we can forget that. It's like, oh, church, we just come to this building and stuff happens. That doesn't work that way. It's like a deep love and a commitment, not only for you, but for those that you know who still have not met the living Jesus. And so this morning, as we begin, I want you to know that some of the things we're going to look at have to do with people who wonder whether God still cares about them. With people who are struggling because they have doubts and they've pain, and when they think about church or God, they associate that with so many negative experiences. Maybe you know someone like that. I want us to think about like what it means that many of us in our lives have all of these expectations that we make for ourselves, for our marriage, for our kids, for our future, and then some of those all fall apart. They start to fade, they change. And then we start to doubt ourselves, and if we're not careful, we start to doubt God. And we wonder how we're going to compete with others, and we feel all of these pressures. So I want us to think about together, what does it mean and how we handle when we experience shattered expectations, and how we learn to trust God more in those moments, not trust Him less. If you have a Bible, I want you to turn to Luke chapter 24. And in Luke chapter 24, there's this incredible story, and it's a profound moment where God meets people. Jesus meets people who have these shattered expectations. If you don't own a Bible and you're visiting and you'd like one, I know the team here would love to give you one. For this morning, as I'm reading through the scriptures, you'll see it on the screen behind me. It'll just help you to understand the story. In Luke chapter 24, you need to have like a few handles to understand the passage. But in this passage, what we're dealing with is Resurrection Sunday morning. That's really what the passage is about. Some of you maybe think about going to church during Easter and, trying to, think about what that story is about. And I want to talk about the story a little bit because so many of the things in this story have helped me as I think about being a pastor in one of the most secular places in North America. When you think of the word secular, I don't know what comes to mind, but going back to Montreal and to Quebec, I was born in Montreal, so I felt like I've gone back home to do something that I never thought I would do. And in doing that, God has had to help me deal with my own expectations of the kind of pastor I thought I'd be. And one thing I never expected I'd be is a church planter. I don't even like church planters. No, I'm kidding. Okay. But, I never thought I would do that. And when people are like, I'm going to go start a church, I'm like, good for you, bro. Like, I don't, that's good. And then to think that one day God would use me in that way required that I surrender some of my expectations. And I let go of some of the other expectations that I had, and I would let them fade and almost just like put them in the past and just trust God with the new things He has in store. Many times I've gone back to Luke chapter 24 to live in the passage of how God is preparing people on that early Easter morning, the beginning of the Christian story, to surrender old expectations and begin to embrace the new things that God wants to do. Now, I need to tell you something important about this story as we read it. If you really want to understand it, because I have a feeling this is the smarter service. Is the smarter service? Some of you are like, oh yeah. Right? That I want you to know that the story we're about to enter into in Luke chapter 24 happens when those who have been with Jesus feel the pain of knowing that He is dead. Jesus is gone. The one that they've loved, the one that they've followed, He's been crucified, and they're not sure how their lives are ever going to be put back together. So we're kind of entering the story in a little bit of a tense moment, and the people that we meet, I'll read the passage in a second, have these shattered expectations of what they thought Jesus was going to do. Here's what we read in verse 13. It says this. That same day, Resurrection Sunday, same day, Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus. They had been in Jerusalem, and they're going back home. And as they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself, the living Jesus himself suddenly came and began to walk with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. This is kind of an important introduction. You need to understand this. It might feel weird, like why isn't Jesus just saying like, ha ha, like I'm alive, right? That's what I would do, right? He's just with them and he enters this moment where they realize, I can't believe we were wrong about him. I can't believe we spent 3 years of our lives following this guy and he's dead. He's gone. Most scholars believe the trek back to Emmaus from Jerusalem could have been up to about a 2-hour walk. And I mean, you could talk about a lot of things in 2 hours. I mean, I walk for 20 minutes, I'm dying. But you know what I mean? It's like they're walking and they're feeling the pain and they're like the expectations. Like, we trusted this guy. Like, you remember the miracles he did? Like, you remember what he said? Remember how people followed him? Like, we knew he was the guy. And now, the long walk back home. They're probably dreading what you and I would be dreading. People who are ready to say to us, told you so. I told you not to follow that guy. I told you not to follow rabbis teaching the Bible. They're going to be the Messiah. Yeah, sure. They're thinking, like, how do we get our jobs back? How do we tell our family that we were wrong? How did we mess this up? Like Jesus. Like they just killed them. If you're not familiar with the Bible, in the ancient world, the Romans were specialists at crushing people who put their hope in Messiah-type figures. People who gave people hope, the Romans had a way of just silencing them. And when we're in this story, we feel this tension, these moments of what it means that they have to learn to surrender their expectations of what they believe God was going to do. Maybe for you, you're at that place to help you reconsider the things that you wanted him to do, but the things he didn't do. Maybe for you, that's been so difficult that you've stopped praying. Or you've said, I've prayed so many times about this, but God doesn't listen to me. I know people who think like God doesn't listen to them because their marriage is struggling or their kids have, left home in a real tense and conflict moments. I know people back home who've experienced bankruptcy in their businesses and they struggle with trusting whether God is with them. Part of my journey as a pastor has been to go back into a place that when people think about God and Jesus and the church, the first thing that comes to their mind is not good news. It's expectations that they had with the church, with people who called themselves Christians that were actually very negative, that they experienced hypocrisy in the church. Nothing here, just back in Quebec. I know it doesn't happen here. And they want nothing to do with church. And my wife and I, we just felt God calling us. I'll tell you a bit about that story, about what it means to leave a church that we loved in Ontario, a church that was growing and God was blessing it and we were doing our best, and the sense that he was calling us to a place that was struggling as people felt their expectations of their lives and of God were shattered. I have a quote just to give you a sense of how complicated it is to live in Quebec when we think about church. You'll see it on the screen. It says this: Quebec boasted of 2,746 churches in 2003. Since then, 713 have been destroyed, closed, or converted. They're converted into gyms and condo developments. If you're a Christian, this should burden you. If you're not a Christian, you might not even care. I know people in my life who are not Christians, my brother's an aggressive atheist, and stats like this are good news to them. They're like, great, we need less churches, not more. In a secular culture, people are conflicted about how to feel about church, about faith, about trusting God again. And my wife and I had to deal with our own expectations as we wondered if God was really calling us to go do this. Calling us to go do something that we knew was going to be difficult. We were going to trust God with our finances and try to figure out how to raise money. And I remember starting to feel God saying to me, all the expectations you have for your life, will you leave them in my hands? Will you just let them go if I change things? And I was like, I could preach about that, but then to live it is a whole different thing. And I remember feeling early on that God was saying, it's time for you to go back home, which was my home growing up, back home, and plant a church. And I'm like, oh, no, this can't be God. I'm going to ignore that. It can't be God. And I remember my wife said something to me when we got engaged. She said, I'll marry you if we never live in Quebec. So I'm like, yes, it's going to be perfect. Because you always need somebody to blame if you're in heaven. And Jesus is like, why didn't you do that? It was her. And I remember telling my wife, like this feeling was starting to sense, like, I know you love where we are. And my wife grew up in southern Ontario in a town called, well, a small city called Sarnia. Anyone familiar with Sarnia? Sounds like Narnia? Yeah. Anyway, it feels like Narnia when you live there. I'm kidding. If you're from Sarnia, we love you. Okay. So she grew up there. Her family lived close to us. It was really beautiful. We had all of our expectations set. We had comfort. Everybody loves that. We had a good job, cash, people need that. We were kind of like, we're going to coast for a little bit, you know. And when you experience enough of those things, you're like, God's with us. And now God's like, that's not what I called you to. You think that's all I called you to do is to live like a comfortable life? I'm like, please tell me there's a verse in the Bible for that. Nope. He said, I'm calling you to step out in faith. So I tell this to my wife. And I say, you know what? I'm sensing we have to go to Quebec, but maybe it's not from God. So if you don't sense that, we're going to stay right here. So I leave that with her. We decide we're not going to really tell our families too much. My family's from Montreal. Her family's from Ontario. If we tell my family, they're like, of course the Lord is calling you to come home. You know, something cheesy like that. And her family's definitely going to be like, that's of the devil. Why would he call you to a secular place like Quebec? You know, all this tension. And one day I'll never forget. It's part of summertime. We had a guest speaker at our church. And the guest was a missionary. And the missionary just shared some stories of the sacrifices that people are making around the world so that people would understand the love of Jesus for the first time. And we went to church, we heard it, I'm like, this is amazing, was encouraged, was thinking about this is so beautiful. We go back home, we had small kids at the time. My wife is sitting on the couch, and I notice that she's starting to cry. And as she's crying, I'm like, hey babe, like, is everything okay? And she says to me, today when that preacher was preaching about making a sacrifice for God, Jesus spoke to me about Quebec. I was like, what did he say? What did he say? She says, I think you're right. We have to go and plant a church. I'm like, no! You know when God answers your prayers, but you're mad a little bit? You're like, what? She's like, I think you're right. I think we have to go do this. So we picked up our family, told the church that we loved it was time to go, and we surrendered our expectations that God was doing something we never imagined. I don't tell these stories and I don't go around sharing this because I'm super spiritual or my wife and I have a special connection to God. I'm sharing this with you because this morning I want you to believe that God is calling you to do the same thing. Wherever you're at, it might not be to plant a church, it might not be to be a missionary, but it does mean that you need to surrender your expectations. And when they feel shattered and when they feel like they're changing, maybe that's God preparing you for something new. The disciples have. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down, that they experience something important, that Jesus gives them room to doubt without despairing. It's a very simple concept. What does it mean that Jesus is going to meet them in their doubts without them despairing that everything is lost? And at one point, this is what Jesus says. It's so profound. He said to them, what is this conversation that you're having or holding with each other as you walk? And as they stood still, they looking sad, then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? And he said to them, what things? It's amazing. The living Jesus is walking with these guys. And there's a sense of sadness. And Jesus does what he's always done from the beginning of his ministry. You know what he does? He asks people questions. Now he asks them questions. He has this incredible ability to be in their pain and in their sadness and in their loss of expectation. And he says to them, like, what are you guys talking about? Like, why are you guys sad? This is such great news for us. This is such great news that Jesus is still meeting people in their doubts and in their questions today. He's still doing that. He's doing that for me. He's doing that for you. It's available to people you know who are doubting about God and about faith. Jesus is still meeting people in these painful places. And I remember early on when we went back to plant this church, thinking, God, I'm going to need to hear the questions that people have that maybe I've ignored. I kind of had an experience of church early on in my life where the church I kind of grew up in for a little bit and I wasn't really into church too much was answering questions nobody was asking. We're just good at doing this in church. We're going to answer questions that we feel make us feel confident. We're going to answer questions that'll prove to you that we're right and you're wrong. But the real questions that people are asking sometimes, we're just not listening to them because we're not close enough to the pain, close enough to the suffering, close enough to the struggles, close enough to the doubts. And you know what I felt too when I'm with parents or grandparents? Sometimes we're afraid of hearing the questions even of the next generation. We're afraid of hearing the questions from a secular culture because you know what? We're afraid we don't have the answers. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay for us to be in those questions and says, we don't know yet, but Jesus does. And he'll be with us like he's been with his disciples from the beginning. What kind of question would Jesus ask you today? If he met you in a moment where you feel like an expectation that you have, something you dreamed about is falling apart, something that burdens you or feels so overwhelming that if you went to bed tonight, you're like, I'd be praying about this thing. What would Jesus ask you? What would he say to you? Maybe he would ask you to just talk about it with someone. Sometimes talking to someone about something that's burdening us helps us to realize we're not alone. Can I let you know that people in a secular culture are going to need all kinds of space to talk about the things that they associate when they think about church. Jesus asked them this question. This is what they answered Jesus. They say this: we had hoped that he was the Messiah. Like we hoped that the Jesus guy who's dead, he would be the one who would set us free. And Messiah means anointed one in the ancient language, who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. Then some women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early in the morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them Jesus is alive. Can you imagine to be so discouraged that even when you get the good news that Jesus' body is not there and that he might be alive and there's angels, like the angels would get me, right? They're like, we don't believe this. It's too weird. We know you're trying to be excited, but we think like he's really gone or they put his body somewhere else. That these disciples of Jesus still make their way back home. They decide that they're going to leave and they're going to move on. And remember, who is with them? The living Jesus. Now, I want to be honest. When I get to this point in the story, I often get really upset. Okay, maybe you get upset when you read the Bible, right? I get upset because I'm like, Jesus, just tell them. Like they're sad, they're overwhelmed, like you're gone. This is the time where Jesus says, ha ha, it's me. I'm here. He doesn't do that. And it kind of makes us feel awkward, like when we're reading the Bible, to struggle with that. Because we live in a culture that we should know and move quickly to the answer. In our context, I talk about everything has to be a shortcut, right? We're the life hack generation. Like everything's a life hack. How fast can I get through school? How fast can I get married? How fast? And then we read the Bible and Jesus is slowly walking living in the pain, listening, and we're like, wow, that Jesus would do that. That Jesus might be doing that to you and to me, teaching us something, giving us room to talk about our doubts, to wrestle. I want to show you in the next few verses that Jesus is going to stretch them before he shows them who he really is. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this idea down because Jesus is going to take them back to their Bible to help them understand it in a new way when he speaks to them. And then this is what we're told. He said to them, how foolish you are. Doesn't mean like foolish the way we would, but how did you miss this, right? And how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to them what was said in all of the scriptures concerning himself. He still doesn't tell them that he's alive. He doesn't tell them yet that he's with them, but he takes them back to the ancient scriptures of Israel, which is the Old Testament, and begins to stretch their understanding of the Bible before he shows them who he really is. Maybe you never thought about it this way, but the first thing the resurrected Jesus does is a Bible study with his disciples. He begins to say, hey, you've read this before, but let's go back to it again. Maybe you felt that in your life, right? Like, you know the Bible, I have a Bible, I've been a Christian. And maybe for you, a shattered expectation moment is Jesus inviting you to go back to the Bible with new eyes, with a fresh perspective, to see something you didn't see there before. If he's doing this with his earliest disciples, trust me, he's doing that with us. He's teaching us how to hear the Bible again, how to read it again. Maybe for you, this is such a new experience. You're like, a Bible? Like, I don't even know like how to read it. Like in Montreal, and I think about the people we help, there are people who come to our church and they've never held a Bible in their life. they're visiting and they're like, why are there numbers in this book? Like, where do I find? Like, one person asked me once, I didn't say this earlier, but one person once asked me, he's like, what are the people's names at the bottom of the screen when you're reading? I'm like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, like those. Yeah, who are those people? I'm like, oh my God, what a great question. Those were people who, some of them were with Jesus when he was alive. And people are like, I never heard that before. Things we take for granted when we're reading the Bible. We're going to have to go back and begin to help people where they're at to understand and to revisit the scriptures again. And what good news that Jesus does that with his earliest disciples. On that resurrection morning, he's walking them through this. Now, I want to show you that as we learn to do this better, as we learn to do this in our own lives, God will help us engage with people in our culture who will need help with this. Years ago, I read a book called Leaving Christianity. It's an important book on a lot of levels. It has graphs, has a lot of data. But the authors of this book, and you'll see the quote behind me, this is what they say about what's happening in our culture today. They say the research shows that many youth and young adults haven't even been exposed to Christianity. The result is a religious landscape that we have never seen before. That we are entering into a future where there's not a secular culture trying to shut down Christianity. There's not a secular culture trying to avoid us being Christians. There's a secular culture that doesn't even know enough about Christianity to critique it. Like they don't even care about us. And we have experienced that on so many levels. If we told people we started a church, they'd be like, that's amazing, that's good for you. You know what people in a secular culture are doing right now? They're sleeping. Or they're like having brunch somewhere. They're not thinking, how do we shut down a church? We're like, that's a lot of work, we don't care. And we have all of these paradigms about how bad the world is out there. It's so dangerous. Now, it's going to be complicated, but you know what people in a secular culture are going to need? They're going to need help to know just what the Bible even is and how we learn about Jesus and how the Messiah from the prophets was spoken about. And Jesus is doing that with his disciples. He's beginning to help them. For some of you today, if you can embrace that God is stretching you before he shows you the answer that you want, God is preparing you to help your kids and your grandchildren make sense of their faith in the future. He's preparing you to not just give a simple answer, oh, it's right here in the Bible, but to say, tell me what you're struggling with. Tell me what the doubt might be. Let's listen to this together. Let's go back to the scriptures together. Let's engage in this together in a new way. When God begins to stretch us and our expectations that we thought we would, anticipate or have, they begin to fade. God calls us to a deeper place in our faith. Are you open to that? Are you open to this very simple idea? Jesus is doing this with these two disciples. Do they know that it's Jesus yet? That's not a trick question. They still do not know it's Jesus. Okay? They don't know that the resurrected Jesus is with them. And so this week, I want you to make me a promise. Ready? The promise is that you are going to read all of this section of Luke. Okay? Turn to the person next to you and say, I'm going to read this passage this week. Do it right now. If you're watching online, find somebody near you. Don't lie in church. You can't lie in church. Can't lie. Listen to it at the gym. I don't care what you do. Ask your kids to read it to you. It's just a simple thing to go back and read this amazing story. You're like, this is incredible. The reason I want you to read it is because so many beautiful things happen in the middle of the story. Jesus continues to walk with them, talks to them. And at one point, there's this crossroad moment in the story where they get to their home, they get to their village, and Jesus acts as if he's going to just continue to walk on. And if you know the story, they say to him, where are you going? You should come in and stay with us. You should come in and hang out with us a bit more. Come, you need a meal. And what's beautiful about this moment is they're doing what Jesus had taught them to do, which is show hospitality to a stranger. Open up your home and make room for someone you might not know. They're actually doing the thing that they were taught by Jesus to do, but now they're doing it with Jesus himself. And they invite Jesus in, and they're talking and eating, and at one point, the profound moment in the story, this is what happens. You'll see it on the screen. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And then he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road and while he opened to us the scriptures? This profound moment that I'm like, Jesus, you could have done this so much earlier. I would have done it at the beginning of the story. He said, no. They just need to trust me And now they would see who Jesus is as Jesus sits and breaks bread with them, reminding them of the sacrifice that he did for them. This profound moment in the story where we learn that God is inviting them, Jesus is inviting them to surrender their old expectations of God for a whole host of new things that God is going to do. They have no idea that Jesus is preparing them to be the first leaders of the church, that because of their testimony and because of their sacrifice, we are here today worshiping the living Jesus. Because of their lives and because of their commitment to say yes to Jesus, we would have a Bible that we can just read today. Just imagine, because they were willing to surrender old expectations for new expectations, for a host of whole new things that they never imagined. And what's beautiful about the story is that what they do next is so meaningful to our church back home. They do a 180. As soon as they get home and they realize Jesus is alive, they turn around and they head back to Jerusalem. The 180 is actually the name of the church we planted in Montreal. You'll actually see a picture of it behind me. We named it the 180 because we really believe that Jesus is still turning people's lives around. He really is. The longer story about it is we named it a number because of the conflict over language in Quebec. And we thought if we pick a number for the church, we can plant churches in any language. You know what I'm saying? That's what we're about. And so we did this, and so many people, they're like, yeah, though, just Jesus is still doing this? Like, Jesus is still turning people's lives around? Or like, Jesus was doing this from the beginning. Every time I think of people at our church, they remind me of the struggle of these two disciples on that first Easter morning. They have doubts, and they're sad, and they're not sure there's anybody who cares about it. And Jesus says, tell me about these struggles. They're wondering about their lives and meaning and purpose and if life is going to matter. And they need to hear the scriptures in a new way, in a fresh way. And then what they need more than anything is to believe that God doesn't want to just save them so they go to heaven someday when they die, but that God wants to transform them now so that they can begin to experience kind of new expectations that God would use them in this life now. Some of you maybe have stopped believing that about your lives. You've stopped believing that God wants to use you for more than just have a good job and be nice to your neighbor. By the way, you should do that. But God is calling each of us to be open to like new expectations that'll be scary and overwhelming. And again, maybe not planting a church, but maybe starting to pray for a coworker. Maybe telling a son or a daughter that you understand their doubts in a deeper way. Maybe admitting when you're struggling with your own faith and saying, you know what, I need someone else to pray for me because I'm struggling. I just need to be honest with this. You're surrounded around some people here at Connexus that would love to help with that. And I think about people in our church that when they've come to our church, they've wondered, is this a safe place for me to share my deepest struggles? Does Jesus really care about people who don't have it all together? Does he still use people like he did in the Bible times? I often tell the story of one person, and I have many. A person who visited our church, and he came maybe year one of our church. We meet in this warehouse, as you saw in the picture, and he came because he was dating a girl, and that's always a good way to get somebody in church, right? He's dating this girl, and he really quickly said, I'm not into church, I'm not into this religious stuff. And as part of the sermon, as I was preaching that Sunday, I quoted Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is one of the greatest philosophers the past few years. And he said, you know what, it's very weird. I've never heard a priest quote a philosopher like Nietzsche. And I'm like, well, I'm not really a priest, but I get it, whatever. So he just has all of these questions about God, whether I'm a priest, he's confused that I'm married. He's like, wait a second, like this is all brand new. He's like, those real tattoos? I'm like, maybe. Okay, so all these questions, right, about all these different things. And he's like, I have so many questions about this stuff, but I'm not into this church stuff. And I said to him, you know what, if you ever want to have a coffee, I don't mind like connecting and answering questions. He's like, you do that with people? I'm like, yeah, I would love to do that. By the way, you can do that with people. Just have a coffee, just listening. And when you're tempted to just say, read this prayer and say yes to Jesus, remember, Jesus walked and listened. And I remember listening to his questions. He struggles with church, wondering if you could trust the Bible, all of these things. And we kept meeting, and slowly he would visit church a little bit more often. And I'll never forget, like one Sunday, he showed up at church, again, this girl, not sure what he believes, when we were taking communion. And, you know, we often say this in our church, if you're new here and you're celebrating communion, you know, for people it can be weird. It feels like, is this a cult? Like, what are you doing with the bread and the juice? What is that? What's happening? So we would always explain this to people and say, this is a very sacred thing that Christians have done from the beginning. And this friend of mine who I was chatting with, he would say to me, you know, whenever you talk about the bread and the cup, even though I don't take it, I always feel like I want to cry on the inside. But I don't know why. I'm like, I don't know. What do you think that means? And we kept talking and kept walking with him and kept journeying with him. And a few years would continue to go down the line. And 5 years later, after we journeyed together and cried and laughed, 5 years later, he came to me. And he said those words that every pastor, every parent wants somebody to hear, just because I think I'm ready and I think I understand Jesus is calling me now. I'm like, wow. I ended up baptizing him in our church. And I for how quickly this would be, whether he would get it, whether I knew the right words, God was walking with me to walk this person to the place where they could say yes to Jesus. God brought me here this morning to tell you that he wants to use you in similar ways. In your life, if you're willing to say, my expectations of my life sound good to me, but if they're not what you want from me, God, I surrender. Your own expectations for your kids and for your family, and maybe hear Jesus ask you some new questions. Jesus calling you to trust him in deeper ways. It's pretty simple. One, be honest about your doubts. And be so honest that you can be with other people as they doubt. Remember that no one grows deeper in their faith if they don't go back to the scriptures and hear the Bible in fresh ways and learn it in fresh ways. And also at its core, be ready to do things you never thought you would do, because you will never be able to do those things in your own strength. It will be God in you that transforms people around you. Before I leave, let me just pray for you. Let's just stand. Father, we thank you for Jesus and for the gift of his life. And we thank you for what it means that Jesus is alive, means that we can be alive now. We thank you that you have these amazing expectations for us that we sometimes might not even believe. I pray for anyone in this room, anyone watching online on a podcast, just maybe wondering whether you have a plan for their life that is bigger than their plans for their life. That you would begin to stretch them and show them and teach them what it means that shattered expectations are sacred moments where you call us to deeper places. I pray someone in this room who's maybe doubting about the Bible, doubting about church. They need to just know that you can meet them in their sadness, in their anger, in their frustration. Jesus, would you do that right now the way you did it with your earliest disciples, the way you've done it for me in my life? Would you meet with them and begin to restore things that they thought would never be healed? And would you begin to stir in this church, in the leadership, and the staff, and the elders, this fresh vision for what it means to be a church for people in a complex secular culture? One that, if we're honest, we don't really always understand. But what we do understand is that, Jesus, you love to meet people in broken places, people with their questions, and you love to show them that your expectations for their life are so much more beautiful than their own. So do this in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.